Griffin. Thanks for coming back with me this week. This week is going to be episode 3, and we're excited to come back and share the scriptures. My co-host Ken Heidebreck is out this week, but I'm going to be leading you through a lot of the scriptures that tell us how the Messiah faces the Assyrian, which is the beast of Revelation, at his return. So, and actually, we're even going to throw in some extra biblical books like Jasher and Enoch, because they allude to not just the background setting of the beast of Revelation, but also his final judgment as well. So, but guys, tonight I'm excited because tonight we are going to be looking at the beast of Revelation, who he is in history, who he is in the context of the entire Bible, all the scriptures, and then how the Messiah deals with him when he returns. Because ultimately, the beast of Revelation is whom I would call what Habakkuk 3 calls the head of the house of evil. And the reason for this is that has a long-standing history. Because, we know the book of Enoch, it tells us about how these 200 rebellious angels descended during the days of Watcher. These 200 rebellious Watcher angels descended during the days of Jared, and they took wives, as Genesis 6 tells us, as Enoch chapter 6 and 7 tell us. And during the course of this, they actually received a punishment. They were actually, Enoch was kind of the go-to for them to be announced punishment to them. And if we look closely in the book of Enoch, we see that the majority of those guys were punished, and they were under the authority and the rule of Samyaza. But yet there's a separate and distinct punishment for a special angel called Azazel. And this Azazel cat we see mentioned later in the book of Enoch. And that's actually one of the things we're going to get to at the end of this program. So stick around to the end, because it all matters to the beast of Revelation as well. And I'm excited to share this information with you guys. If you have any questions throughout the program, be sure to put them in the comments. I'm going to try to check them as much as I can with the live stream, and we'll try to answer as many as we can throughout but since it's just me tonight, it'd be a little challenging to try to answer live chat as I go with the presentation as well, but I'll do my best. If not, I'll just try to get to them after the broadcast as best I can. So at any point you have a question, make sure to put it in the comments. All right, guys, tonight I'm excited because this presentation here is basically, we're going to be discussing a pretty significant character all throughout Scripture. And the reason for this is because this guy basically is King Nimrod of ancient Babylon. So this isn't giving away the end of the show because it's actually going to get better as we go along. The whole purpose of this is that this King Nimrod was the originator of the Tower of Babel. And he's actually being spoken of in Isaiah 14. Now, the entire thing, and I think it's verse 3 or 4, it says, take up an oracle against the king of Babylon. And many people have thought throughout history that it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, because during the days of Isaiah, that was, a few generations before the rise of Nebuchadnezzar in Assyria. But if we look through the actual context of Revelation 14, we start to see some really peculiar phrasing that doesn't match at all the King Nebuchadnezzar, doesn't match his life or his death, and nor does it match anything that would be about describe him as far as him being in Sheol, which is what we see in the middle parts of Isaiah chapter 14, where it says that the Rephaim are roused to stir at your coming, because they see this guy who destroyed nations, and they wondered, how did you get down here? How'd you? So they're kind of surprised to see him, and but that's because we have to learn about who Nimrod really was. And so in Isaiah 14:25, it says, God says that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains I will tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. Now, there's something that I want to make sure we understand as a strong connection here. Baal is identified with Molech, and this is something that I hope that we're going to go into here in the second segment of this presentation tonight. Just like we see all the gods that required worship for child sacrifice, we're going to connect those with Scripture, because it matters to whom we see who the beast of Revelation is. And I will just run through this real quick so I can show you guys. Revelation 17:8, just to give us a premise. It says, the beast that you saw was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, those whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and yet is, and is not and yet is. So the idea here is that this guy, this beast who was and is not and yet is, this whole concept here is that he is basically when John is seeing this in the book of Revelation, and chapter 17 is actually explaining what he saw in chapter 9 of Revelation. And he's talking about the beast who came up out of the bottomless pit. And they're saying he was, but he is not, but he yet, or excuse me, he is not, but yet is. And so this idea is that he's, and we all know this, that or many people are already aware of this fact, that this is alluding to a character that people already knew about, but during the days of John, he was not, quote unquote, on the earth. He was not out of the pit yet, right? So therefore he was not. And then once we get back to the actual moment when he ascends out of the pit, he is again. So this is alluding to his resurrection, that he's coming back. And so and that's why when he's described in Revelation 9, chapter 9, it's a totally different concept than what we might expect, right? That's why it's called a beast, because he has unique characteristics about him to be called that beast. And so I think that this is important to see here in Revelation 9, verse 1 and 2. It says, "Then the fifth angel sounded. I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth, and the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit." And then we skip down to verse 11, where it says, "And they have as king over them the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in the Greek he has the name Apollyon." Now, this is really important for us to understand why he has this name, because in this moment here, it's given us exactly the name of the beast, the one who came up out of the pit, who's over these other entities. Now, many people will say, well, wait a minute, I thought this was Satan. Well, nowhere in Scripture is Satan in the pit. He's actually out roaming, right? Like a roaring lion seeking whom he devour. We see in Job chapter 1 and 2, as Satan comes before the Father with the other angels. And, Yahweh's like, hey, where you been? And then, Satan's like, oh, I've been roaming around to and fro on the earth. So, so this is where we have this idea that, this idea that Satan himself is not locked up yet, and that we don't actually see him get locked up until the Messiah returns, and then the conclusion of Revelation 19 into the first verse of Revelation 20, where Michael and, as Enoch tells us, 3 other angels, they take great chains and they bind Azazel, which I'm claiming is Satan from all my research. And they bind Satan, this dragon, the serpent of old, and they actually, put him in his actual punishment that was prescribed to him in Enoch chapters 8 and 10. So that's the final conclusion of his judgment that was cast on him so long ago. But this, in the meantime, he's been let out. He's been roaming around doing his thing. And we actually see this concept of how he took on someone in the course of history to be his mouthpiece and his figurehead. And that's why we get those descriptions in Revelation 13 when it talks about the beast and how he moved in all the authority of Satan, the dragon. And we see that in Revelation 13. Now, the reason for that is because, you have the Satan may have the authority, but he needs someone to enact it on the earth. So that, in my opinion, this is the supposed reasoning for the way he would behave like this in a sense of hierarchy, not just because he's trying to emulate the hierarchy between the Father and the Messiah, the Father and the Son of God, but simply that he's trying to stay out as much as possible, to keep his hands free technically as much as possible, so that he can stave off any judgment to the last point as long as possible. It's so the theory here is that this idea of Satan is he actually has such an amazing amount of information, or amazing amount of knowledge of the law of God, that he knows just enough to do and just enough not to do, so that he's actually not punished until the very last moment, right? So the actual Messiah returns, and it's time to actually stamp out evil and wickedness from the land of promise and set down the New Jerusalem. So that's why, in my opinion, we see Satan using humans to do his will as much as possible. And he found one human who was just foolish enough to be his ultimate mouthpiece. And there's no wonder, in my opinion, they would call that, you have that colloquial term like, don't be a Nimrod, right? Meaning don't be stupid. Because it seems like Nimrod was the guy that was just foolish enough to try to go in to such a degree of allegiance, if you will, to subject himself to Satan to such a degree where in the pantheon of ancient cultures, we have this consistent character, which I'm about to build the case for you in the next few verses, and the next slides and from Scripture, that this pantheon of gods that we see referenced from different names from different cultures throughout the Old Testament, that this guy was formerly Nimrod, who's been deified and worshipped as Baal and Molech and all these other guys, and he was subject to Satan. And we're going to see the parallels of that. All right, so let's get into that real quick. This part right here is this is basically where we're going with some of this. Baal or Baalim. We're all very familiar with Baal. We know who he was. Considered the male god of the Phoenicians and Canaanites. He's mentioned in several places in the Scripture, many times. Judges 2, 1 Kings 18, Jeremiah 2, Hosea 2. The point of this guy is that he's identified in Jeremiah 19 as being with Molech, and Molech was the famous, infamous bull, and he's represented as a bull and also as an owl. We see a lot of Masonic architecture and symbology with him being an owl in modern times, but even in ancient times as well. This idea here is that in Jeremiah 19, verses 4 through 5, it says, "Because they have forsaken me and have made this an alien place and have burned sacrifices in it to other gods, that neither they nor their forefathers nor the kings of Judah have ever known. And because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, a thing which I never commanded or spoke of, nor did it ever enter my mind." It's a horrible thing, guys. This is, we obviously know that from the Torah itself, Leviticus 18, he does not condone child sacrifice or human sacrifice in any regard. And it says in Leviticus 18:21, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh." And then here as well, we have in Psalm 106 as a reiteration of that. This says, "They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood." And so this idea here was that Molech was actually known to the Israelites as Baal Peor in Numbers 25:3. That's where we saw, the temporary rebellion that we see in Numbers 25, where I think this is a story where Phinehas has to come in and stop some things from happening. But also in Deuteronomy 4, verse 3, and it was worshipped up until the time of Samuel, basically. We even see that in Samuel 7:4. And then after the time of Samuel, we see the rebellious northern house of Israel, the 10 tribes, go into full-on apostasy, full-on rebellion. And that's when, we get during like the time of Ahab in 1 Kings 16, we get just a full-on, rebellion of putting up Asherah poles, having the male and female prostitutes at the temples of the shrines of the false gods, sacrificing their children, worshiping Baal, and all the smaller gods that were associated with the head pantheon of the patron god Baal. And so that's where we get like 2 Kings 17:17. It tells us that they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire and practice divination and enchantments and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. So this whole concept here is that we've got a continual practice throughout all of all of it. This whole concept here that, one second, guys, let me take off the screen share. You've got to continue practice throughout all of history, post-flood. Now, I would suggest that this is going on pre-flood, but we have very little information to go off of in the book of Enoch. We do have the ideas of enchantments and sorcery, divination. We have these concepts of the Nephilim becoming demons, and it would not surprise me, since the enemy is pretty consistent with their mode of occultic behavior, that if they were also sacrificing kids to demons before the flood as well, which seems to be par for the course with the way they behave in every culture throughout all of history. And since the Nephilim are directly called demons in the book of Enoch, and that's where their origin came from, was the unclean spirits that resulted from the angels having children with human wives, then it wouldn't surprise me if that kind of practice was still happening before the flood and then just picked back up post-flood. And this is where we get the Table of Nations, right? We get this interesting place where it introduces all the sons, the grandsons of Noah, right? The sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And then through the lineage of Ham, we get Nimrod introduced. And it talks about him, just real quick. I'll go to that and we'll look at that just real quick. Because basically, this guy named Nimrod, he was a special character. He wasn't just anybody. and the point was that he was a descendant of Cush. It says in Genesis chapter 10, it says, "Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from that land he went forth of Asher and built Nineveh and Rehoboth, and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city." Okay, so here's where I want to throw in some fun little stuff, because I think it's really important for us to understand that Nimrod was the initial name that he was introduced to us in Genesis 10. But he's been called by many names, by many different cultures all throughout history. That's why, in my opinion, we see him referenced again, both in the Hebrew and the Greek in Revelation 9 as Abaddon and Apollyon. Now, in the book of Jasher, I'm trying to remember the chapter. I think it's chapter 12. But it directly calls Nimrod Asher or Asir. It's a very, slight phonetic difference. But A-S-I-R, or in some cases A-S-S-U-R, or like we saw in Genesis 10 there, like an A-S-S-H-U-R, just depends on the translator's phonetic interpretation. But in the book of Jasher, it directly calls Asir as well as the same as, it calls him Osiris, and this is a big deal. So Osiris, for many who may not be familiar, was the head god besides Ra. He was the head god of ancient Egypt. He was one of the more famous ancient gods of Egypt. And Osiris was actually a Greek transliteration of the word Asir. So he would actually be more, in the original Egyptian language, would be more of Asir. But to the Greeks, because many people don't realize that throughout history, the Greeks ruled Egypt for over 1,000 years. So you have lots of language translations happening in the history books. But Osiris is just the Greek transliteration for the word Asir. And that's where we get Osiris. But the idea was Osiris was a huge character in ancient Egypt. He's also called Amraphel. And we see that in Genesis 14 in the Battle of the Nine Kings that Abraham has to go rescue Lot as a result of. Amraphel at that time was apparently subject to Chedorlaomer for 13 years. And then we get some mentioning of that in the book of Jasher as well, because Jasher directly calls him Osiris and it directly calls him Amraphel. So we've got two different mentions right there. I would suggest that we've got an even stronger idea with the concept of Baal and that was the deified idea that we see completely carried over through the many cultures in that region for the occultic worship, for all the different pantheons, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Greeks, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, all those guys. They were all worshiping the same family, quote unquote, family of gods, but they spoke different languages at the Tower of Babel, so therefore they're calling them a different name. And as a result of that, we've get all these different mentions throughout Scripture, both of Osiris being referenced as Baal and the family of Baal, the Baalim, as well as his sister wife, Isis, who becomes the Ashtaroth or the Asherah pole, or the Queen of Heaven, as it's referenced in Jeremiah. So that's why it's always talking about the same enemy. And the Israelites are always being instructed to stay away from the same bad guys. And they were always going back and rebelling and worshiping the same bad guys. And Yahweh was always telling them, no, stop doing that. That's evil. It provokes me. Do not do that. It will get you scattered out of the land. It eventually did. It eventually fulfilled all the blessings and the curses we read about in Deuteronomy 27:28. And I was prophesied that if you don't keep my commandments, you're going to be scattered out of the land. And so part of that was, like Leviticus 18:21 we read, was sacrificing to Molech or to Baal their children and practicing sorcery and divination and enchantments. Unfortunately, they just continue to fall back into those patterns, being influenced by the nations around them. So it's very important, in my opinion, for us to understand this historical buildup to this idea that basically this concept of Nimrod just didn't go away after Genesis 10. He's everywhere throughout the Scriptures.
Even a wayward son can notice that his father's abode has fountains, living waters. You've concealed them and prepared them for your kin. Until the kingdom comes and his will is done, our earth will thirst for heaven.